Tonight we're a few hours away from starting to hear the results from the counting in that British referendum. Now, Dion Gous is the Chief Investment Officer at Credo Wealth. He's joining us now on Skype. Good evening to you, Dion. We spoke to you a few days ago, and on that one we hypothesized about what the exit would mean. And I think you gave the answer that it all depends what business you're in and what currency you're in and so on as to whether it suits you or not. But now we're on the day itself, and you obviously have watched the market very closely, but you've also been watching the voting patterns and I suppose trying to sense the mood. And what is your reading of that mood today?
Yes, I think today is essentially an extension of what we've seen the last few days. The market certainly changed quite a lot over the last week or so. So whereas up until about the middle of last week, it seemed to be on a knife edge. The probabilities were moving closer to each other. The odds were quite tight. From about Thursday afternoon onwards last week, it started changing consistently in the direction that on balance of probabilities, people do not expect the Brexit anymore. As recently as this afternoon, the sort of odds on Brexit happening were around 5 to 1 compared to pretty much even money a week ago.
Right, and looking at the way the market has responded to this in South Africa, we had almost no activity on the JSE. It's almost as if whatever positions were taken yesterday, and people today sat back and watched.
Yes, I mean, today was actually a bit of a roller coaster day over here. It opened quite strong and then came off a bit, and then when the US market opened, it ended strong again. So ultimately, I think the UK market was up about 1% or so, 1.2%. Interestingly, and this is true not only today, but the last couple of days where we've seen positive movements in the UK, we've seen even stronger movements in continental Europe. So the DAX and the CAC, for example, are up more than the FTSE. And I think there's a message in that perhaps, and that is that Britain staying in the EU is not only on balance of probabilities from a market point of view considered to be positive, but it's even better for Europe itself to have a strong partner like Britain staying in.
Well, we had the FTSE at a 2-month high at one stage today. That reflected optimism about staying in, and the pound hitting a 2016 high. And maybe the currency is the simplest and quickest way to see what the market is telling us.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw the pound, when after the referendum was announced some months ago, steadily slipping from around 150 to the US dollar to around 140 or so at the low point, which, by the way, is only 1% or so higher than it's been in the last 25 years, namely, since the pound left the exchange rate mechanism, Black Wednesday, when George Soros made his famous billion. That was 25 years ago, and in all that time, the pound that we saw about 8 days ago was only 1% off that all-time low.
Well, that is Dion Gous, Chief Investment Officer at Credo Wealth, joining us from London. But before you go, Dion, I'm going to ask you what I asked Philip Saunders of Investec earlier. Give us a crude and simple prediction here. I think you're expecting a Remain, and by what percentage?
I definitely expect a Remain. I think the margin will be higher than what people predict. I don't think it's on a knife's edge anymore. Of course, I might be wrong, but my hunch would be that we'll see upwards of 55% voting for the Remain camp.
Right, thanks very much for joining us again there, Dion Gous from Credo Wealth, talking from London. Well, we've got a few guests now to talk from different perspectives on the British referendum and what effects it might have and perceived to have on South Africa. There's George Glynos, who is MD and Chief Economist at ETM Analytics. We've got Mohali Ralabitso, who is Chief Executive of the Black Business Council. Maurice Madiba, Founding Director at Cloud Atlas Investing. And also Dipolele Moime, who is Managing Director at Legato Consultancy. Later on, we're going to hear a little bit from Africa's retail giant Christo Wiese, who's also talking to us from Europe. And we expect to talk to the President of Business Leadership South Africa, Saki Matsazoma. So he'll be joining us from Germany to give us a European perspective. But George, let's start with you. After all of that, let's get it down to the hard stuff here. What are you expecting and why?
Look, I think we're also expecting Remain. I think we've been in that camp for quite a long time. It's there's an interesting psychology that happens between the polls and the actual vote. And lest we forget, I'm Greek, so I've been through this twice with 2 referendums.
Yes,
and
it was the Grexit, remember?
It was the Grexit. And in both cases, it almost seemed like voters wanted to send a very clear message to the authorities that they were extremely unhappy with what was going on. But when push came to shove and they had to take a decision, ultimately it was how hard it would hit them in the pocket that counted, and they voted pragmatically, so to speak. Yeah, whether it was the right or wrong decision, I'm not judging that at this point, but that's what happened. And I think we're seeing a repeat of all of this now. So my takeaway from all of this is, in fact, not so much about whether the UK stays or leaves, but it's more a case of just how difficult it is, in fact, to defend the EU at this point, because by rights this should have been a walkover, and it certainly wasn't, which I think says quite a lot about how the EU has been running itself and just how poorly, in fact, they've performed through the course of the past few decades.
Also, unlike the Greek situation, I think a lot of the resentment in Britain at the EU is political, in the sense of daily life being interfered with, not financial and business relationships. So perhaps there's a lot of resentment there that has nothing to do with the ties. Let's talk from an investment perspective. Maurice Madiba is founding director of Cloud Atlas Investing. At a time like this, your clients and you yourself expect to have to get this right. And if you can't get it right, you've got to take positions. Apparently derivatives trade has been very active, where people try and cover themselves against what could happen. So how have you been approaching this?
Yeah, so the way we're looking at it now is looking at market indicators to see what they're telling us. A lot of them are pointing towards a Bremain, as you mentioned earlier. So we're leaning towards that because our business is to reflect the markets. But looking more specifically at African markets, how they're affected, we look at economies such as Morocco, Ivory Coast, which have currencies that are pegged against the euro, and how they're likely to perform. And they've seemed to have held out pretty well so far. But what we're waiting to see is what the vote actually brings out and how wide that margin is. Because the real issue here is around security. For the longest of time, Europe is being under threat. There's been a lot of attacks in the last 2 months than in the history of the euro. So Britain is sort of saying we want our sovereignty. They want to hold off on some immigration, which is the same kind of noise we're hearing from the USA. So if you think about those two economies talking about sovereignty, and us as Africa, we start looking at regional integration, this is quite a significant vote for the markets.
All right, let's go to Dipolelo, and then we'll come to the Black Business Council, where the CEO is Mohale Ralabitsa. Dipolelo, your approach to what's been happening?
Look, from an Africa perspective, we also were on the side of pre-remain, because there's a lot of at stake that we as a continent is going to face if, and let's God forbid it happens, that the Brexit happens. There's a lot of at stake, and obviously there are pros and cons in terms of are they going to stay or are they going to remain. But I think the sentiment now, in a few hours that I've been at work now, that that the guys are going to stay. So it's going to be it's going to reflect very well in terms of for our continent as well. Because you can just imagine when the guys they exit the EU, it's going to be a vast. I talked to Maurice. It's going to be a vast perfect storm. So it's going to be a whole lot of things that we need to do from scratch, and there's a whole lot of at stake in terms of, let's say, for instance, when you talk about trade and trade relations and business going forward.
Well, talking about Black Business Council, Mohale Ralabitsa is the chief executive.
Good evening. Well, we are also expecting that they're going to remain, possibly upwards of 60%. It's called out there being a lone trader, separated from the mainstream. I think one need only go back some over 200 years to the 13 colonies that make up the United States today, having made a decision. Let's forget about the colonial backdrop and suppression of the Native American population, but it's still one of the most powerful political economy acts in the history of mankind. Almost as important, I think, as the opposable thumb and humanity being bipedal. And we say this because the ability to regulate trade across those jurisdictions is something that's becoming simpler inside of the EU. And let's face it, Britain has been losing competitiveness overall. It's not a Germany. It's not some of the smaller but more robust economies further north in Europe. And therefore, Britain's strength is its ability to integrate and to be an integrator of global markets. And exiting the EU would have a significant impact on its own prospects. It's losing core industries, so the financial and other industries are supremely important to the success of Great Britain, it remaining great.
Do you find, and the rest of you as well, your members, your clients, the people who consult you, has this gripped the imagination, George? I mean, are people really interested in this? They're interested, perhaps not always understanding why.
I think they're interested, but it's not so much just an economic argument. So, I hear everything that Mohale said. I think it's for me, what I've been picking up, speaking to colleagues abroad, is that this is, on one part, an emotional choice related to immigration and concerns thereof, and on the other, there is the economic, the economics that the Remain camp have focused on. I think what's troubled me is the campaign that Remain adopted. It was a very negative campaign. It was all about what could go wrong and how devastating it could be, etc., etc. And that didn't focus enough on what Britain was actually gaining out of this. And so that raised a lot of question marks. And I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it really does seem to me an emotional vote versus a sort of a cerebral vote with regards to the economics behind it.
Look, I mean, your average voter is a real living person, and the quickest way to get a reaction out of somebody typically is to stoke their emotions. And fear is one of those which is a significant motivator, particularly when people are worried about loss of benefit against a backdrop where Britain is losing industries and people are concerned about how are we going to create employment, how are we going to look after our children, all of those things which all of us are concerned about.
Of course, the big thing with Britain is it still has its own currency, as opposed to all the other. If Greece had left the Union, it would have had to go back to the drachma, which would have been another whole mission as well.
Yeah.
But also, Britain is not part of the continent geographically. I mean, they can actually, if they want to, close the channel, the tunnel under the channel, and they become an island again off the continent. So psychologically, they still are in many ways, and I think that's also at the back in a sort of visceral way behind them. Still with me in studio, George Glinos, Chief Economist and MD at ETM Analytics, Mohale Ralabitso, who is Chief Executive of the Black Business Council, and we've also got Maurice Madiba, a Founding Director at Cloud Atlas Investing, and Dipolele Moime, Managing Director at Legato Consultancy. But let's first of all go with the President of Business Leadership South Africa, that is Saki Makazoma, and he is talking to us from Germany this evening. Good evening to you, Saki. We've heard a lot about the UK perspective and some of the South African perspective, but this is being watched with great interest from Europe as well, not just from an economic point of view, but a political perspective. What's the mood you're picking up on the continent of Europe itself?
It's interesting because I'm actually interacting with a lot of people, Tories, business people as well, and a lot of them seem to be very surprised that it is as close as it is being called. And a lot of people are actually asking the question as to why the UK had to go there in the first instance, and that this may have been a political act by Cameron that he might leave to regret. I think the greatest surprise is how close it is. And one of the things that also people are picking up is how divisive it has made British politics to be. And references, for instance, are made to the MP that was shot there. There was always no clear linkage in that, but the atmosphere seems to be fairly poisoned, the political atmosphere in the UK. It's a very strange situation also because British law doesn't allow pause and that you would have, for instance, if this was happening in the US. And therefore, people don't have much to go by today, right now.
Yeah. Saki, I saw a comment, apparently there was a Danish comment, I'm not sure official or unofficial, where they said, we also don't like the EU, but please stay to Britain. Almost like saying, let's stick together here, but there is a lot to sort out. And as George Glinos was saying a moment ago, the Remain lobby didn't argue because of the strengths of the EU. It was rather warning of disasters. So where is the European project? I mean, this British referendum must have caused people in Europe also to ask questions.
Yes, I think, there are commentators who are making the point that the real issue also is that there may be a domino effect. And that is, Poland has been quoted as one place, for instance, that might reconsider the position. And the Danes and others. And therefore, This is why I think in this kind of world situation, this kind of referendum, to me, it certainly doesn't make much sense. Listen to both arguments. I mean, the Leave group basically is talking about taking control. As if taking control of, say, for instance, immigration and various other things, including finances. As if there's been a movement of those resources into the EU in terms of finances. The state lobby, on the other hand, is emphasizing job losses and other complications that will arise, like trade treaties, etc.
Yeah.
My sense is that a lot of the business people, though, are making the point that at a time when you really need international trade, when in fact, according to the WTO and other bodies, there is nationalism that is rising in the number of protectionism.
Yeah.
This is not a time to be having this kind of referendum.
That is Saki Makazama. Not a great line there, Saki, but thank you for joining us from Germany, a European perspective there. Saki, of course, President of Business Leadership South Africa. Back in our studio, Mohali, you wanted to pick up on a point or two there.
Yes, it's interesting that Christo was commenting on the whole issue of us having narrowly averted a sovereign rating downgrade, and the fact that
for the moment. Yeah.
For the moment. And in fact, one of the lessons that we need to take from Britain and their reflections about whether to stay in or to exit is something that's very significant for South Africa, because our fortunes have grown significantly from us being better integrated into the rest of the continent, because the untold story of our growth and delivery of our tourism growth strategy is the fact that our arrivals from the rest of the continent have been increasing, and it's in one of those areas where we have been able to create jobs. So we should ourselves be thinking, actually, are we sufficiently integrated into the rest of the continent? Are we continuing to play our catalytic part? And what is it that we can do to grow the level of integration? Shoprite itself has enjoyed increasing fortunes from being better integrated into the continent. We would do well to accelerate our own continental integration projects, particularly because our tourism, retail and other sectors are benefiting tremendously from engaging with economies which, quite frankly, are growing faster than the South African one. And the solution for South Africa is actually better integration into the rest of the continent and absolutely continuing to strengthen our foothold into the likes of the UK and other markets, and ensuring that we're part of the global integration project.
So the African Union becomes more than just a name under that kind of argument down the line.
It's an urgency for us.
Yeah.
You can't switch on a factory and achieve the kind of scale and efficiency that we need to by continuing to be isolationist in our tendencies.
Right, we can come to Maurice and Dipolelo in a moment, but we have Efficient Group Chief Economist on the line. We don't want to lose him on that Skype connection right now. Davi, lessons from this experience for us. We've started talking about that, and perhaps that's something you could pick up on now.
Good evening. Yes, I think a couple of things. I agree with your guests, so far what I've heard at least, and I do think that the South African economy should try to integrate as much as possible with the rest of Africa. There's much that we can offer to the rest of Africa, and certainly what the rest of Africa can offer to us. But I think there's another lesson that we need to learn from what's going on in Europe, and it's not only what's going on in Europe and with Brexit. I think there are other signs globally of perhaps a macroeconomic policy approach by central banks and by the fiscal authorities that is actually contributing to the social and political tensions that one witness all over the place. Now, for example, I would argue that the Sanders phenomenon and the Trump phenomenon in the United States have to do with things like, for example, an exceptionally loose monetary policy approach globally, which is actually contributing to this gap between the haves and the have-nots widening. Exactly the same with the Europeans. I think the fact that the ECB, as an example, has got exceptionally low interest rates and a very accommodative monetary policy is also contributing to this gap between the haves and the have-nots. In the meantime, we've got social tension in the Middle East and that sort of stuff, and that's contributing further to political issues in Europe, and that's a contributing reason why they're probably going to stay, but why a number of British are probably going to vote at least for a possible Brexit. So I think those are some of the lessons. Don't get too much involved in the working of the economies.
Isn't the other lesson perhaps is that you've got to get the alignment between the politics and the sovereignty and the finances and the economy right? I mean, one of the problems with Europe is you have a European central bank, you have one currency, but the governments are independent.
That is, yes. Depending on your school of thought, of course, I would say that's not necessarily a bad thing. I know many economists are going to argue that in order to have one monetary policy, you need to have one fiscal policy as well. In fact, I think one monetary policy can actually put a lot of pressure on to make sure that fiscal policy is well managed. I think one of the mistakes that was made was allowing the Germans to start off with by breaching the so-called Maastricht criteria. The Germans were the first guys to breach that 3% deficit to GDP ratio. Now they're in a very difficult position telling the Greeks what to do. But yes, I do agree, there's certainly a school of thought saying that if you want to be the United States of Europe, you have to be a proper United States, which will include proper political integration and of course proper fiscal integration as well. And perhaps that's another lesson for us in Africa, is that we have simply too many countries in Africa. We have to integrate our economies much better in Africa, and that will probably include having a single currency or at least fewer currencies in Africa, and certainly we have to do something about all these borders. You cannot integrate economies when you have 50 tiny economies in Africa. Well, it will make much more sense to have fewer larger economies in this huge continent of ours.
That is Efficient Group Chief Economist Davy Rood. Thanks, Davy, for joining us. Sort of nodding in the studio here while this is going on. Maurice.
Yeah, that's African integration is exactly our business. So it's absolutely clear for us from a political and a social perspective and economic that we have to work towards African integration. The one thing that the EU teaches us is that they've got a lot of unified policies, a unified central bank. In Africa, that won't happen overnight. So there's also a lot of soft building that has to take place to integrate the continent. So we have to work towards that. But it is also gives you an indication why Britain wants to leave the EU, because of all the regulation that has now tied the hands of financial institutions in Europe. It's very difficult because of the fact that there are so many countries under one central bank. So in Africa, that's a lesson for us to look out for. But I do have to emphasize that African integration is very important. And as Dr. Wies was saying a little bit earlier, speaking about, we've got bigger problems in South Africa, we do have fundamentally big problems to worry about in SA. At the same time, one thing he didn't mention was that our currency is the most liquid emerging market currency. So if people have any issues or they're edgy about emerging markets, they're most likely to sell the rand off quite significantly. So you end up finding South Africa suffers in the event of a Brexit. But if it stays on, then as the rand is doing now, it continues to strengthen.
Right, that is Maurice Madiba, who is founding director at Cloud Atlas. Our other guests, Dipolelo, George and Mohale, we're going to come back to in a moment. Just in case you're wondering when are we going to hear the result of this, well, they've got various counting areas, and each counting area in Britain announces its result when it's done the counting. And of course then the computer experts extrapolate that based on the history of that particular area to see if they can predict the final result. And those early counted results we're expecting around about 11 o'clock tonight British time, which means about 1 o'clock in the morning for us, where we, maybe earlier, we'll expect to see the trend. Back to our panel in a moment, coverage of the UK referendum, to leave or not to leave. Now we've got in the studio Dipolelo Moime of Legato Consultancy. It's your turn again.
I think what's happening now in Britain is very good lessons for us as Africans, as South Africans. And picking up from Maurice's opinion in terms of regional integration, I think we have done quite well in few months, few years now. You can look at the West Africa with their stock exchange now, what they're doing. And they're positioning Cote d'Ivoire as the base of the regional stock exchange in the continent. And also you must look at in East Africa, where Kenya now it's like positioned like a gateway into the market. So what's happening now in EU? It's for us. It's a great lesson. It's a great lesson that we must learn. And we must learn very hard, because politics, they can happen at any point in time. People can promise you stuff that it's not going to happen, and just because they want to get your sentiments up and up. So we should really look into this experience and ensure that in the next coming whatever decades we don't go through that, and we don't experience that. Because look, we've got 54 countries in this continent. There's a whole lot of people who are staying in this continent. There are a whole lot of economies that we can integrate and make it just one. And we've got a vast amount of benefits to reap we've got one continent or one country.
What would also be nice to do away with border blockages like we have just between
Yep.
here and Zimbabwe, for example.
Exactly.
Mohali?
We have a ridiculous set of developments at our borders. One, there aren't enough trains going through. There's too many trucks that are
Yeah.
stopped. And I think it's between the border between South Africa, Zambia and Botswana or somewhere, there's literally a barge. And once that barge is moving, it has a truck on it, you have to wait. And it takes way too long to move people and goods across our borders. It's bad for the economy of the continent. It's bad for the people of this continent, for them to be sold and to cling on to recidivist notions of being of sovereignty in the old days, as though we were still in the Middle Kingdom or something.
Yeah.
And we have to get our policymakers moving faster. So maybe we should get the president that new jet, and so that he can spend more time connecting us while the European project is still stalling and deciding whether it wants to move forward or not. We have to get our act together. We can't continue to have it be that it's easier in some instances for us to remove goods, like during the colonial days, from the continent and get them to Europe and other parts of the world, than it is to move them across the continent.
And that's the big problem. Xenophobia, there's more to that word than meets the eye.
Yeah, but I mean, just to a point Mohali's just made, you know, free trade is the lubricant of strong economies. And Mr. Makuzoma mentioned, or he issued us a warning of the dangers of protectionism. We heard from Davi, who spoke to us about the mismanagement of a lot of these economies. You can tie all of this together quite nicely, because really the lessons there are: get the basics in an economy right. That goes. That's by the way, a very strong central theme that can be applied to Africa. Because before we start talking about unions and stuff like that, we need to get the basics right. Once you get the basics right, the next thing you need to focus on is that free trade. And you get that free trade going, you stay away from protectionism as much as you possibly can. Because it's when your economy is running well that you start to distance yourself away from a lot of the social ills that we experience, or that any economy experiences when things are not running well. The fact that we've got so much social upheaval, both in Europe, in the UK, South Africa, speaks to a very difficult economic climate that's unfolding at the moment, where people are struggling to come out at the end of the month, where inflation's a problem, where disposable income is tight, where households are battling to come out. Naturally, you get the uprisings of things like xenophobia and whatnot. Now, we've seen it in Germany, the likes of the UK. They're all experiencing something not too dissimilar, maybe without the same level of violence, although that's debatable. But
It's just
that's
less visible.
It's just as visible, and I think the point is that get your economy running, and things like xenophobia
Will follow or not follow. That's
Exactly.
what we don't want that. So let's just go around our special panel here this evening one more time to wrap it up. And whatever else you want to say, I want you to give me a number, a percentage, by which I think you all seem to be saying that they're going to vote to stay in. So what's the percentage going to be, Maurice, and your other concluding comments?
Okay, I like high numbers, so I'd put it at 62. My concluding comment, we should be concerned about the Brexit. I mean, Africa has historical ties with Britain that go centuries back. So knowing what's happening with that country is quite important, and also being integrated in the whole global economy is very important for us. But we also don't need to lose sight of the fact that Africa needs to be integrated, you know, and we need to, that needs to stem from a political point of view and also from an economic point of view.
Tipolelo.
I think 6%. I'll go with a high number as well. And that's like I mentioned before, there are great lessons that we need to learn from this experience and apply in our own continent. And let's hope the 500,000 people, South African people who stay in London, they did cast their vote tonight, and we
made the
averted.
difference.
Let's hope we make a difference. We averted the disaster that might have.
Yeah, it makes us feel special, that.
Yeah.
Of course, the British must be feeling very special, all this attention on them, everyone begging them to stay or go. Mohali, your concluding remarks.
I think it's also going to be in the 60
60s?
percentiles. And I think, as we've all said, unanimously, that there's an important set of lessons for us here. Let's ask Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma to stay on longer at the AU. Let's accelerate the integration project, and also be mindful that when the Brexit discussions are over, let's get back to marketing South Africa as an investment and a tourism destination. We are entering that period where it's a bit of an off-season. Let's get those campaigns out and get people visiting South Africa. there's nothing that's going to shift our fortunes faster than growing tourism, and the challenge inside of that will be to make sure that that pie is better distributed inside of South Africa so we can perform to our economic potential.
And as Christa Wiese said earlier, these are things we can control. George, wrapping up.
Yeah, I'll probably, to be a little bit different, I'll go into the 50s. So let's call it 55. But, for me, the take-home message out of all of this is a reminder to policymakers and politicians to drop the arrogance, to become well connected with the people on the ground, understand what their concerns are properly, so that this kind of thing doesn't have to come about, because I think that's what we're staring at right now. It's a disconnect between those people that are running the EU and what the people in all the different constituencies are in fact feeling.
We'll end our special edition of Business Tonight right there. So thanks to George Glinos, he's MD and Chief Economist at ETM Analytics, Gumahali Ralabitso, Chief Executive of the Black Business Council, Maurice Madiba, who is Founding Director at Cloud Atlas Investing, and Dipolele Moime, Managing Director of Legato Consultancy.